Meet Jordan Matthews, the new police chief tasked with cleaning up a broken precinct. Faced with internal corruption, a divided team, and a community that no longer trusts the force, Jordan is determined to reform from within. But as she battles resistance from veteran officers and confronts dangerous opposition, the pressure to rebuild intensifies. Can she unite her team and restore trust in the department, or will the challenges be too great to overcome? Subscribe to follow this gripping story of leadership and transformation, and comment below. What would you do in Jordan's shoes? The streets were quieter than Jordan Matthews expected as she drove into Arborville, a small city she had only visited a few times. It wasn't quite rural, but the dense urban feel of her hometown Detroit was absent. This place had an air of calm, a deceptive calm, she knew, the kind that could hide its problems behind clean streets and small-town politeness. Jordan gripped the steering wheel of her SUV a little tighter as she turned onto Maple Street, the road leading to the police department, where she'd begin her first day as police chief. The thought still felt surreal to her, Chief Jordan Matthews. She had worked her entire career for this moment, yet now that it was here, she couldn't shake the nervous tension that buzzed beneath the surface of her professional exterior. The position was hard-won, especially for a black woman in law enforcement. The glass ceiling in the field wasn't just made of glass, it was bulletproof. Jordan had smashed through it, but the bruises from that fight still lingered. Racism, sexism, bias. She'd seen it all. And while she'd dealt with it in every precinct she'd ever worked, being in charge didn't erase it. If anything, her new title put a larger target on her back. As she approached the police station, Jordan's phone buzzed in the console next to her. She glanced at the screen. Mom. The pit in her stomach tightened further. Of course, she muttered, ignoring the call for now. Jordan loved her mother deeply, but today wasn't the day for a keep-your-chin-up pep talk. She needed to focus. Pulling into the station's parking lot, Jordan noticed the variety of cars, some pristine, some beaten down. The disparity matched the officers she'd soon be overseeing, a divided precinct, split between the older veterans set in their ways and a newer generation of recruits who hadn't yet been poisoned by the old guard's cynicism. As she stepped out of her vehicle, the early morning air felt heavy, the weight of expectation hanging over her. Jordan adjusted her navy blue uniform and checked her reflection in the car window. Her hair was neatly braided back, and her sharp brown eyes radiated a calm confidence. She looked every part the seasoned officer she was. But beneath the surface, she could feel her heartbeat picking up. "I've got this," she whispered, then squared her shoulders and headed inside. The front desk officer looked up as she entered, his face a mixture of surprise and confusion. Jordan gave him a polite smile and approached. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "I'm Chief Jordan Matthews." The officer, a white man in his late 40s, quickly fumbled with his notepad, then stood up awkwardly. Yes, Chief. I didn't expect you so early. Welcome. I'm Officer Tony Novak." "Nice to meet you, Officer Novak." She glanced around the station, the buzz of activity subdued but present. Officers moved through the hallways, clearly trying to get a look at her without being obvious. Jordan had been in enough police stations to know that people were already talking about her. They'd probably been talking about her since the announcement of her appointment weeks ago. "Could you show me to my office?" Jordan asked. "Of course, Chief." Novak scurried around the desk, leading her down the hall toward the office reserved for the chief. The station had an old-school feel, wooden desks, faded posters about community policing, and the faint smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. As they reached the office, Novak fumbled with the keys before unlocking the door. The room was spacious, with a large window that looked out onto the street below. On the wall behind the desk were framed photos of the previous police chiefs, all of them white men with stoic expressions, their gazes judgmental, as if daring her to take their place. Jordan stepped inside and took in the sight of her new domain. It felt heavy, as though decades of unsolved problems, unchecked power, and systemic bias had seeped into the very walls. "I'll let you get settled in," Novak said, standing awkwardly by the door. "Thank you, officer," Jordan said, watching him leave. When the door closed behind him, she let out a long breath. Later that afternoon, after getting her bearings and making a few introductory calls, Jordan knew it was time to start meeting her officers. She had scheduled an introductory briefing for the entire department, her chance to set the tone. Jordan entered the meeting room to find a mix of officers already seated. Some, like Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, sat upright, clearly eager to hear what the new chief had to say. Others, like Captain Bill Anderson, leaned back in their chairs, their arms crossed, projecting an air of resistance. Anderson was a hulking man in his mid-50s, his graying hair and deep-set eyes making him look like a cop from a bygone era. He'd served as interim chief before her appointment and clearly hadn't been thrilled about being passed over for the permanent position. Jordan walked to the front of the room, the quiet murmurs dying down as she approached the podium. Every eye was on her, and she could feel the tension radiating off some of the officers. "This is it, Jordan, time to lead." "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice strong but measured. "I'm Chief Jordan Matthews, and I'm excited to get started working with all of you. Arborville has a reputation for being a tight-knit community, and I believe we can continue to foster a positive relationship between the department and the citizens we serve." Her eyes scanned the room, gauging reactions. Sarah Thompson gave her a small nod of encouragement. Anderson, however, remained unmoved, his expression unreadable. Jordan pressed on, determined not to let the undercurrent of resistance sway her. "I'm not here to shake things up for the sake of change, but I do believe there are areas where we can improve. We're all here for one reason, to protect and serve this community. And that means holding ourselves accountable, just as we expect others to do." A slight murmur passed through the room at the word accountable. Jordan noted it, but didn't falter. "I know some of you might be wondering what my plans are, how I intend to lead this department," she continued. "The truth is, I'm here to work with you, not against you. But I will not tolerate bias, misconduct, or any behavior that undermines the trust this community has placed in us." She saw Anderson shift in his seat, his jaw tightening. Jordan knew he was listening closely, sizing her up. "Let him," she thought. "I'm ready." The briefing ended with polite applause from most of the officers, but Jordan could feel the coldness from others as they filed out. Anderson lingered, watching her intently. When the room was nearly empty, he approached. "You've got some high ideals, Chief," he said, his voice gruff. "But I've been here long enough to know that ideals don't always fit with the realities of this job." Jordan met his gaze without flinching. "I'm aware of the challenges, Captain Anderson, but I also know that real change is possible. I've seen it happen before." He nodded slowly, though his expression remained stony. "Well, we'll see about that, won't we?" As he turned and walked away, Jordan felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. The battle lines were already being drawn, but she wasn't about to back down. This was her precinct now. Jordan leaned back in her chair, glancing at the clock on the wall. The day had been long, and her first real test had yet to come. 4:45 p.m. The precinct was winding down for the day, officers heading home to their families, paperwork being finished up, and the faint hum of conversation filling the hallways. But Jordan's mind was still churning. The department's system was archaic, both in its policies and in its mindset. She had read through some internal memos from months before her arrival, small, almost trivial complaints about leadership, dismissed by Captain Anderson when he had been the interim chief. It was clear now that Anderson had kept things running, but he hadn't pushed for change. He was complacent. And complacency in law enforcement was a dangerous thing. Jordan had spent the afternoon walking the precinct, trying to get a feel for the culture here. Some officers had greeted her with respect, if somewhat formal, and she knew those were the ones she might be able to work with. Others, like Anderson's crew, had barely acknowledged her presence. She picked up a file from her desk, an internal report on Officer Eric Jenkins. He'd been involved in a minor disciplinary matter a few months back, but nothing serious. From what she had observed earlier, Jenkins seemed like someone who hadn't fully chosen a side yet. He wasn't openly hostile like Anderson, but he wasn't all in either. Jordan wondered if he might be worth investing time in, molding him into someone who could help her build bridges in the department. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, sitting up straight. The door opened, and Lieutenant Sarah Thompson stepped inside. The familiar sight of her made Jordan feel a bit more at ease. Sarah had been one of the few officers to offer Jordan a warm welcome on her first day, and her presence brought some much-needed relief from the tension simmering in the precinct. "Got a minute, Chief?" Sarah asked. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Sarah closed the door and took a seat across from Jordan. She looked tired. The lines around her eyes deepened after what had clearly been a long shift. "I've been hearing things," Sarah said quietly, "about some of the guys, especially Anderson." Jordan nodded. "I'm sure you have. It's not exactly subtle." Sarah leaned in, her voice dropping. "It's more than that. He's stirring things up, getting the older officers on edge. They feel like you're coming in to change everything, and they don't like it." Jordan exhaled slowly, her suspicions confirmed. "That's what I'm here for, Sarah. This department has a problem, and I'm not going to sit back and watch it continue." "I get that, I do," Sarah said, her tone full of empathy. "But Anderson's got allies. They're loyal to him, and they've been in this game a long time. You'll need to tread carefully, Chief. He's not going to back down easily." Jordan met Sarah's gaze, appreciating the honesty. "I don't expect him to back down. I've faced men like Anderson before, in other precincts. But this is different. This time, I'm in charge." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Just watch your back. Not everyone here is ready for the changes you want to make." Jordan stood up, walking over to the window. The street outside was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the pavement. She turned back to Sarah, determination etched into her face. "I didn't come here expecting it to be easy, Sarah, but I'm not going to be intimidated. We have a responsibility to this community, and that means making hard choices. If Anderson wants to resist, he'll have to do it while I'm standing my ground." Sarah nodded again, standing up. "You've got my support, Chief. Just thought you should know what's going on behind the scenes." Jordan smiled faintly. "Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that." As Sarah left the office, Jordan felt the weight of the battle ahead pressing down on her. Anderson wasn't just a stubborn officer clinging to his old ways. He was a potential threat to her ability to lead. And if she didn't take control of the department soon, it would only get worse. The next morning, Jordan arrived early, determined to take the next step in addressing the growing tension. She called for a department-wide briefing, sending a clear message that she wasn't going to let things slide. The briefing room filled slowly, officers chatting quietly as they took their seats. Jordan stood at the front of the room, scanning the faces of her officers. Some looked eager, like Officer Pete Hernandez, a younger patrolman who had been vocal about supporting Jordan's vision for change. Others, like Captain Anderson and Officer Matt Reynolds, sat with arms crossed, their expressions closed off and wary. Jordan cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and commanding. I wanted to take this time to address some things head on." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We are here to serve this community, and that means we need to be better. We need to be more accountable, more transparent, and more willing to evolve. I know that change is hard, but it's necessary." Jordan could see Anderson shift in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but she pressed on, refusing to let his silent defiance deter her. "As police officers, we hold a position of trust in this community. People look to us for protection, for fairness. But when we fall short, when we let bias or misconduct go unchecked, we lose that trust." The room remained quiet, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "I'm not here to point fingers," Jordan said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But I am here to make sure we do our jobs the right way. That means no more turning a blind eye to misconduct, no more accepting the status quo just because it's easier." A faint murmur ran through the crowd, but no one dared speak up yet. Jordan could feel the tension, the unease among some of the officers. They knew she was serious. "I've already begun reviewing some of the department's protocols," Jordan continued, "and I plan to implement changes that will ensure we operate with integrity and accountability. I'll be introducing mandatory bias training and stronger internal oversight. These aren't suggestions, they're requirements." At this, Anderson leaned forward in his chair, his brow furrowing. Jordan locked eyes with him, holding his gaze for a long, tense moment. "Any questions?" she asked, knowing full well that Anderson would be the first to speak. Sure enough, Anderson raised his hand slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Captain Anderson," Jordan prompted, her tone neutral but firm. Anderson stood up, clearing his throat. "With all due respect, Chief, we've been policing this community for a long time. We've built trust with the people here. I'm just wondering if you think all these changes are really necessary. Seems like you're implying we've been doing something wrong all these years." Jordan felt the air in the room tighten as every officer turned to watch the exchange. This was it, the moment when the lines would be drawn. "I'm not implying anything," Jordan said, keeping her voice calm. "I'm saying that we can always do better. Policing isn't static. The needs of our community evolve, and we have to evolve with them." Anderson nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of challenge in his eyes. "But if we start changing too much, too fast, we might lose what makes this department strong." Jordan held his gaze. "Captain Anderson, I understand the importance of tradition, but holding on to old ways just because they're comfortable doesn't make us strong. It makes us stagnant, and stagnation leads to problems." The room was so silent that Jordan could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Anderson seemed to consider her words for a moment before finally sitting back down, his face impassive. Jordan didn't let herself relax, knowing that this was only the beginning. "We're going to do things right," she said, turning her attention back to the rest of the room. "I expect every one of you to step up and be part of the solution. We're not just here to wear a badge, we're here to serve, and that means change is non-negotiable." A few officers nodded, some looking genuinely moved by her words. Others, like Reynolds, exchanged furtive glances, clearly displeased. Jordan ended the meeting with a nod and stepped away from the podium. As the officers filed out, she caught Reynolds murmuring something to Anderson. She couldn't hear what he said, but the look on Anderson's face told her everything she needed to know. They weren't done fighting her, not by a long shot. Later that day, as Jordan made her rounds through the precinct, she noticed Officer Eric Jenkins standing by the coffee machine, looking troubled. He saw her approaching and straightened up, giving her a respectful nod. "Chief," he said, his voice a little unsure. "Jenkins," Jordan replied, sensing there was something on his mind. "Everything all right?" He hesitated, then glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "It's about this morning's briefing. I get what you're saying about needing to change things, but some of they don't see it that way." Jordan crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "Go on." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "It's just Anderson's been here a long time, and he's got a lot of pull with the veterans. They trust him. But I don't know if they're willing to follow you yet. A lot of them feel like you're coming in too strong." Jordan nodded slowly, appreciating his honesty. "I understand that change can be uncomfortable, Jenkins. But if we don't address these issues now, they'll only get worse." Jenkins rubbed the back of his neck, looking conflicted. "Yeah, I know. I'm just not sure where I stand yet." Jordan gave him a small smile. "Take your time. But when you do decide, I hope you'll be on the right side of this." Jenkins nodded, though he still seemed uncertain. As Jordan walked away, she couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. Jenkins was young, idealistic. He could still be swayed. But Anderson's influence was strong, and Jordan knew that the real battle for control of the department was just beginning. The next few days at the precinct were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and decision-making. Jordan had spent most of her time in her office, reviewing cases, protocols, and learning more about the officers under her command. But the tension within the department had only grown more palpable since her last briefing. She could feel it in the way the veterans watched her, especially Anderson. He hadn't spoken to her directly since their exchange during the meeting, but Jordan knew he was biding his time. She also knew that the officers loyal to him, Officer Matt Reynolds chief among them, were watching her closely, waiting for her to slip up. They weren't hiding their displeasure anymore, but Jordan wasn't going to give them any excuses to undermine her. Not yet. Jordan was no stranger to scrutiny. Throughout her career, she had faced resistance, judgment, and bias. Being a black woman in law enforcement came with its own set of challenges, and now that she was in charge, the stakes were even higher. But she wasn't about to let the weight of her new role crush her. She hadn't come this far to fail. It was early morning when Lieutenant Sarah Thompson knocked on her door again, interrupting Jordan's thoughts. "Come in," Jordan called, looking up from her laptop. Sarah stepped inside, carrying a stack of papers. "Got the updated patrol reports for you," she said, setting them down on Jordan's desk. "And there's something else you should know." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Reynolds has been making rounds in the locker room. He's talking to some of the veterans, trying to rally them." Jordan sighed, closing her laptop. "I figured as much." "What's he saying?" Sarah crossed her arms, her expression serious. "He's claiming you're making the department too soft, that you don't understand how things work around here. He's got Anderson on his side, and they're stirring up resentment." Jordan nodded slowly, feeling a mix of frustration and resolve building inside her. And the others. The younger officers, people like Officer Pete Hernandez, are staying quiet for now, but I don't know how long that will last if Anderson and Reynolds keep this up. Jordan leaned back in her chair, thinking. She had expected resistance, but knowing it was being organized was a different story. If Reynolds and Anderson were actively trying to undermine her leadership, she had to act before their influence spread. "They're testing me," Jordan said quietly. "They want to see if I'll back down." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. But you should know, some of us are with you, Chief. We see what you're trying to do." Jordan gave her a grateful smile. "I appreciate that, Sarah. Really, I do." Sarah stood as though preparing to leave, but then paused. "One more thing," she added. "There's a community outreach event tomorrow evening. The mayor's going to be there. I thought it might be a good opportunity for you to get out there and show the community that you're serious about the changes you're making." Jordan considered it for a moment. Mayor Evelyn Davis had been the one to push for her appointment in the first place, but she had stayed relatively quiet since Jordan's arrival. A public appearance might help solidify her support in the community and show the officers that she wasn't just focused on internal matters. "That's a good idea," Jordan said, nodding. "I'll be there." Later that afternoon, Jordan found herself walking the floor of the precinct, trying to get a better feel for her officers. As she passed through the break room, she spotted Officer Eric Jenkins sitting alone at one of the tables nursing a cup of coffee. "Jenkins," she called, walking over. "Got a minute?" Jenkins looked up, surprised, and quickly stood up. "Yes, Chief, of course." "Sit," Jordan said, gesturing to the seat across from him. She sat down, watching him closely as he did the same. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Jordan began. "I know you've been here for a few years now, and I've heard good things about your work." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Thank you, Chief." "I also know you've been hearing a lot of things around the precinct lately," Jordan continued. "Things about me, about the changes I'm trying to make." Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, there's been some talk." Jordan leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "And where do you stand on all of this, Jenkins? Are you with me, or are you with Anderson and Reynolds?" Jenkins blinked, clearly caught off guard by her directness. I'm not with anyone, Chief. I just want to do my job." Jordan smiled faintly. "That's a good answer, but sooner or later you're going to have to choose a side." Jenkins looked down at his coffee, his expression conflicted. "I know, it's just, Anderson's been here a long time. He's got a lot of respect from the guys." Jordan nodded slowly. "I get that, but respect has to be earned, and Anderson isn't interested in earning mine." Jenkins didn't say anything, but Jordan could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was young, impressionable, someone who could be swayed either way. She needed officers like him to step up, to believe in her vision for change. "I want you to know something, Jenkins," Jordan said, her tone serious. "I'm not here to destroy this department. I'm here to fix it, but I need people I can trust to help me do that." Jenkins looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time. "I'll think about it, Chief." Jordan nodded, satisfied with that for now. "Good. Let me know when you've made your decision." The next evening, Jordan attended the community outreach event Sarah had mentioned. It was being held at a local community center, and the atmosphere was festive but informal. The mayor, Evelyn Davis, was already there, mingling with local leaders and shaking hands with the citizens. Jordan had been through these types of events before, and she knew their importance, especially now when her position was under scrutiny. As she stepped into the room, she felt eyes on her. Some of the people there knew who she was, but others were still unsure about the new police chief. Arborville wasn't Detroit. It wasn't used to a police chief like Jordan Matthews, but she had to show them that she was more than capable of leading. Jordan made her way through the crowd, shaking hands and introducing herself. She met with community leaders, local business owners, and residents who had their own concerns about crime in the city. Most of them seemed receptive, but there were still lingering doubts in the eyes of a few. They had been used to seeing people like Anderson in charge, someone who maintained the status quo. Jordan represented change, and change was often met with suspicion. After about half an hour, Jordan spotted the mayor standing by a table, talking to one of the city council members. She approached, giving a polite nod. "Mayor Davis," Jordan said, extending her hand. "Good to see you." The mayor turned, smiling warmly. "Chief Matthews, I'm glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it," Jordan replied, shaking her hand. The mayor gestured toward the crowd. "What do you think? Quite the turnout." Jordan glanced around the room, nodding. "It's good to see the community involved, but there's a lot of work to be done." The mayor raised an eyebrow. her smile fading slightly. "You're already making waves, I hear." Jordan met her gaze steadily. "There are problems in the department, Mayor, problems that have been ignored for too long. If I'm going to lead effectively, I can't ignore them." Mayor Davis studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I appointed you because I believed you could bring change, Chief. But Arborville is a small city. People here don't like conflict. They like things to run smoothly." Jordan's jaw tightened. Sometimes conflict is necessary to fix what's broken. The mayor nodded slowly, though her expression remained cautious. "Just be careful. You've got people's attention now, but that can change quickly if things get too messy." Jordan resisted the urge to bristle at the warning. She understood the mayor's position. She was a politician after all, but Jordan's job wasn't about pleasing politicians. It was about protecting the community and holding her officers accountable. "I understand, Mayor," Jordan said, her tone even. "But I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to do my job." The mayor gave her a small, approving smile. "Good. Just make sure you're doing the right thing for the city, not just for the department." Jordan nodded, though the conversation left her feeling unsettled. "I am doing the right thing," she thought, "and I won't let anyone stand in my way." Back at the precinct the next morning, the tension was thicker than ever. Jordan could feel it in the air as soon as she stepped through the doors. Whispers echoed through the halls, officers gathering in small groups, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever she passed. She made her way to her office, but before she could sit down, Sarah knocked on her door. "Chief, we've got a problem," Sarah said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What is it?" Jordan asked, already sensing that something had happened. "It's Anderson. He's called a meeting with some of the veterans, off-site, unofficial. He's trying to rally them against you." Jordan's jaw clenched, her fingers tightening around the edge of her desk. She had expected this, but knowing it was happening didn't make it any easier. "How many?" she asked. "At least 10, Sarah replied, "maybe more. They're planning to make some noise with the union, file complaints against you. They're saying you're pushing too hard, too fast." Jordan sat down, her mind racing. So this is it. Anderson wasn't just resisting quietly anymore. He was actively organizing against her. "All right," Jordan said, her voice calm but firm. "Let him rally whoever he wants. We'll deal with it." Sarah looked concerned. "You know this could turn ugly, right? If Anderson gets enough of them on his side, the union could cause real problems for you." Jordan nodded, feeling the weight of her position settle on her shoulders again. But she wasn't about to back down. "I've faced worse," she said quietly, "and I'm not going to let Anderson or anyone else undermine what I'm trying to do here." Sarah nodded, but Jordan could see the worry in her eyes. "I'll keep an eye on things," Sarah said. "But be careful, Chief. Anderson's got more support than you think." Jordan gave her a tight smile. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll handle it." As Sarah left, Jordan leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The fight was coming, and she would need all the allies she could get. The days that followed Sarah's warning were some of the most challenging Jordan had faced in her career. The whispers within the precinct had grown louder. Officers loyal to Anderson were becoming more brazen in their defiance. The lines had been drawn, and Jordan could feel the weight of the impending clash pressing down on her shoulders. She sat in her office one morning, staring at the latest round of complaints filed against her. Some were petty, criticisms of her leadership style or decisions she had made about patrol shifts. Others were more serious, with Anderson's name attached to several of them. He was relentless in his efforts to undermine her, and it was starting to take its toll on the department. Sarah knocked on her door before stepping inside, her face serious. "Chief," she said quietly, "we've got a situation." Jordan looked up, already dreading the answer. What now? There's been a confrontation in the locker room. Jenkins got into it with Reynolds. Jordan's heart sank. Jenkins. The young officer had been on the fence, but she had hoped he would choose the right side. Now it seemed like the conflict had reached a boiling point. "Is he okay?" Jordan asked, standing up from her desk. "He's fine," Sarah replied. But things got heated. Reynolds was pushing him about the changes you're making, and Jenkins pushed back. I think Reynolds was trying to provoke him. Jordan sighed, feeling the frustration bubble up inside her. Reynolds had been a problem from the beginning, and now he was actively trying to sow discord among the officers who were still on the fence. "I'll talk to Jenkins," Jordan said, her voice tense, "and keep an eye on Reynolds." "He's getting more aggressive," Sarah nodded. "Will do." Jordan found Jenkins sitting in one of the precinct's smaller meeting rooms, his head in his hands. He looked up when she entered, his face a mixture of frustration and guilt. "Chief," he said, standing up quickly. "Sit down, Jenkins," Jordan said, taking a seat across from him. "Sarah told me what happened." Jenkins sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "I'm sorry, Chief. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. Reynolds was he was pushing me, saying I didn't have the guts to stand up to you. I shouldn't have let him get to me." Jordan studied him for a moment, seeing the tension in his posture. Reynolds was trying to break him. She had seen this tactic before: create division, push someone until they snap, then use that reaction as proof of their weakness. "It's not your fault," Jordan said. "Reynolds is trying to cause trouble, and he's looking for people to drag down with him. You didn't fall for it." Jenkins shook his head, his frustration still evident. "It feels like everything's falling apart. Half the guys don't even know what they believe anymore. They're scared of the changes, and Reynolds is making it worse." Jordan nodded slowly, understanding his concern. She had seen the fractures forming in the department. Anderson's group was growing bolder, and the officers caught in the middle were feeling the pressure from both sides. "Listen, Jenkins," Jordan said, her tone firm but reassuring. "I know things are rough right now, and I know it's hard to stand up when everyone around you is pushing back. But you need to ask yourself what kind of cop you want to be. Do you want to be someone who goes along with the crowd, or do you want to be someone who stands up for what's right?" Jenkins hesitated, his eyes downcast. "I want to do the right thing, Chief. I just don't know what that is anymore." Jordan leaned forward slightly. "You know what it is, you just need to trust yourself." Jenkins looked up, meeting her gaze for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're right, I'll figure it out." Jordan stood up, offering him a small smile. "Good. Now get back to work, we've got a lot to do." Jenkins left the room, and Jordan felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't fully committed yet, but she could see that he was getting there. She just needed to keep him on the right path. But Reynolds, he was going to be a bigger problem than she had anticipated. Later that afternoon, Jordan was in her office when her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from the mayor's office. "Meeting with Mayor Davis tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Jordan frowned. The mayor? She hadn't expected to hear from Evelyn Davis so soon after the community event. Her conversation with the mayor had been brief, but Jordan had gotten the distinct impression that Davis was wary of the growing conflict within the department. Jordan sighed, knowing this meeting was likely going to be about Anderson and the unrest he was stirring. The mayor wanted things to run smoothly, and Anderson was doing everything he could to make sure they didn't. Let him try. Jordan wasn't going to back down. The next morning, Jordan arrived at City Hall for her meeting with Mayor Davis. The building was a stark contrast to the precinct, clean, quiet, and orderly. Jordan stepped into the mayor's office and found Evelyn Davis sitting behind her desk, looking as polished and composed as ever. "Chief Matthews," the mayor said, standing to greet her. "Please have a seat." Jordan nodded, taking the offered chair. The mayor didn't waste any time getting to the point. "I've been hearing some things from the department," Mayor Davis said, folding her hands on the desk. "There seems to be a lot of unrest among the officers, particularly those who have been with us the longest. Captain Anderson's name has come up more than once." Jordan nodded, her expression neutral. "That's true. There's been resistance to the changes I've implemented, and Anderson has been at the forefront of that resistance." The mayor studied her for a moment, then sighed. "I appointed you because I believed you were the right person to lead this department, but I also need this city to run smoothly, Chief. We can't afford a fractured police force." Jordan resisted the urge to bristle at the mayor's words. Smoothly? How could the mayor expect things to run smoothly when the department had been rotting from within for years? "I understand your concerns, Mayor," Jordan said, keeping her tone measured. "But the fact is the department has serious problems that can't be ignored. Anderson and his group are resisting because they don't want to be held accountable. That's the issue here." Mayor Davis raised an eyebrow. "And you think pushing them harder is the solution?" Jordan took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I think that real change doesn't happen without pushback. If we let people like Anderson dictate how things are done, we'll never fix the systemic problems that exist in the department. I'm not here to smooth things over. I'm here to do what's right for this city." The mayor leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "All right, but be careful, Chief. Anderson has a lot of influence, and if this situation escalates, it could reflect badly on both of us." Jordan nodded. "I'll handle it, Mayor." The mayor gave her a tight smile. "I trust you will." As Jordan left the office, she couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. Reflect badly on us. She had expected the mayor to be more supportive, but it was clear that Davis was more concerned about political fallout than actually fixing the department's problems. "I'm not here to play politics," Jordan thought as she headed back to the precinct. "I'm here to make this department better." When Jordan returned to the precinct later that morning, she found Sarah waiting for her in the hallway. "Chief," Sarah said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "There's been another meeting, off-site. Anderson's group is getting bigger." Jordan's jaw tightened. "How many?" "About a dozen officers, maybe more. They're talking about filing formal complaints, going to the union." Jordan felt the tension in her chest tightening. This was escalating faster than she had anticipated. Anderson wasn't just stirring up trouble anymore, he was actively organizing against her. "They're pushing back hard," Sarah continued, her voice low, "and they're getting more vocal. If we don't do something soon, this is going to blow up." Jordan nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected it to get this organized so quickly. Anderson was playing a dangerous game, and if she didn't move fast, the whole department could spiral out of control. "I need to address this head on," Jordan said finally. "I'm calling a meeting with Anderson and his group. We're going to settle this once and for all." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure that's a good idea? Anderson's not going to back down easily." "I'm not asking him to back down," Jordan said, her voice cold and firm. "I'm going to remind him who's in charge." Later that afternoon, Jordan sent out the notice for an emergency meeting. She knew it would raise eyebrows, but she didn't care. This was about control, about showing the department that she wasn't afraid of Anderson's tactics. As the officers gathered in the briefing room, Jordan stood at the front, her expression unreadable. Anderson sat near the back, his arms crossed, flanked by Reynolds and several other veteran officers. The tension in the room was palpable. Jordan waited until everyone was seated before she spoke. "I called this meeting because I believe it's time we clear the air," she began, her voice steady. "There have been rumors, complaints, and a lot of talk about the changes I've made to this department." She paused, letting her words sink in. I want to make one thing very clear, she continued, her eyes scanning the room. I am the chief of this department, and while I am open to discussion and feedback, I will not tolerate insubordination. This department is going to change, whether some of you like it or not. Anderson shifted in his seat, his expression hard. Jordan could see the defiance in his eyes, but she pressed on. I know there are those of you who are resistant to these changes, she said, her gaze landing on Anderson. But resisting accountability is not the answer. If you have a problem with the way I'm running this department, you are welcome to come to me directly. But let me be clear. Undermining my authority, spreading rumors, and attempting to divide this department will not be tolerated. A murmur ran through the room, but no one spoke up. Jordan could feel the tension rising, the anticipation of what would come next. If you can't get on board with the direction this department is heading, Jordan said, her voice cold and cutting, then maybe it's time for you to consider other options. Because I will not allow anyone to stand in the way of making this department better. The silence that followed was deafening. Anderson's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Jordan could see the frustration in his eyes, but she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a direct confrontation. Not yet. I expect all of you to conduct yourselves with professionalism and integrity, Jordan said, her tone final. That's all. As the officers filed out of the room, Jordan caught Anderson's eye. He held her gaze for a long moment before finally turning away, walking out with Reynolds at his side. The atmosphere in the precinct had grown thicker since Jordan's emergency meeting. As she walked through the halls, she could feel the eyes on her. There was a tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. Some officers had started to distance themselves from her, while others, those like Sarah and Pete Hernandez, had become even more openly supportive. But the most troubling development was the divide that had formed. Some officers, particularly the veterans loyal to Anderson, had become more emboldened in their resistance. They no longer bothered to hide their disdain for her leadership. And then there were those like Officer Eric Jenkins, officers caught in the middle, unsure of which side to stand on. Jordan knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Jordan was reviewing patrol assignments in her office when her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. You should know Reynolds is rallying again in the locker room. Heard him talking to a few more guys about going to the union. Jordan clenched her jaw, her patience wearing thin. Reynolds again. He was pushing hard, trying to stir up as much trouble as he could, and Anderson was giving him cover. Jordan had thought that after the emergency meeting things would cool down, but it seemed like the veterans were only becoming more entrenched. She had dealt with difficult officers before, but this was different. The insubordination was so blatant, and it wasn't just coming from one or two officers, it was spreading. Jordan stood up, grabbed her jacket, and headed out of her office. It's time to make another statement, she thought. As she made her way toward the locker room, she passed several officers who avoided her gaze. She could see the lines forming more clearly now. Some officers were openly avoiding her, while others nodded in respect as she passed. The division was palpable. When Jordan reached the locker room door, she hesitated for a moment, steadying herself. Then, without knocking, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Reynolds was there, leaning against a locker, his arms crossed, talking to two other officers. Officers Dale Richards and Brian McCall, both veterans. When they saw Jordan, the conversation stopped, and all three of them straightened up. The tension in the room spiked instantly. "Chief," Reynolds said, his tone casual but with an unmistakable edge. "Something I can help you with?" Jordan stared at him, her eyes cold. "I hear you've been having some conversations, Reynolds. Care to explain?" Reynolds smirked, exchanging a quick glance with Richards and McCall. "Just talking with the guys, Chief. Nothing wrong with a little conversation, right? Jordan stepped closer, her presence dominating the small space. That depends on the conversation. If you're trying to undermine my authority or rally officers to go to the union with complaints, then we've got a problem. Reynolds' smirk faded, and his expression hardened. We're just exercising our rights, Chief. You know, the same rights we're supposed to be protecting. Jordan's jaw tightened. Your rights don't include undermining this department or trying to divide it. I won't tolerate that. McCall, standing to the side, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Richards, however, crossed his arms, clearly backing Reynolds. With all due respect, Chief, Richards said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, not everyone agrees with how you're running things. You've come in here and flipped everything upside down. Guys like Anderson have been running this department for years, and now you expect us to just fall in line without question? Jordan's gaze flicked to Richards. That's exactly what I expect. This department is going to change, and it's going to change now. If you don't like that, you're free to file a complaint through the proper channels. But I won't have you or anyone else trying to turn this place into a battleground. Reynolds stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. We've built this department, Chief. You've been here for what, a couple of months? You think you can come in and start calling the shots without any pushback? Jordan met his gaze, her eyes unflinching. That's exactly what I think. And if you continue to push me, Reynolds, you're going to find yourself in a lot more trouble than you realize. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Reynolds stared at her, his jaw clenched, clearly angry but not willing to escalate things further. Not yet, at least. Jordan gave him one final look before turning on her heel and walking out of the locker room. As she stepped back into the hallway, she took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This isn't over, she thought. Not by a long shot. Later that day, Jordan sat in her office, staring out the window. The confrontation with Reynolds had left her feeling unsettled. She had hoped that putting her foot down would send a clear message, but instead, it seemed to have only intensified the resistance. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Sarah or one of the other officers. To her surprise, it was Officer Jenkins. He stepped into the room, looking hesitant but determined. "Chief," he said quietly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Jordan nodded, motioning for him to sit. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Jenkins sat down, fidgeting slightly in his seat. He looked nervous, and Jordan could tell something was weighing on him. I wanted to talk to you about what's been going on around here," Jenkins began, his voice uncertain. "I know you've got a lot of people pushing back against you, and I know Reynolds and Anderson are leading most of it. But I don't think everyone feels the way they do." Jordan studied him, her expression softening. "Go on." Jenkins took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "A lot of the younger officers, guys like me and Hernandez, we see what you're trying to do. We get it. But we're stuck between two sides. On one hand, we've got guys like Anderson and Reynolds who've been around forever, and they're telling us you don't understand how things work here. But on the other hand, we can see that the department isn't perfect. Things need to change." Jordan leaned forward slightly, her gaze focused on Jenkins. "And where do you stand?" Jenkins hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I want to be on the right side of this, Chief. I do. But I've known guys like Reynolds my whole career. They're not going to give up easily, and they've got a lot of influence. It's hard to just turn my back on that." Jordan nodded slowly, understanding the internal conflict he was facing. "I'm not asking you to turn your back on anyone, Jenkins. I'm asking you to stand up for what's right. You're a good cop, and you've got potential. But you need to decide what kind of cop you want to be. Do you want to be someone who goes along with the crowd because it's easier, or do you want to be someone who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard? Jenkins looked down at his hands, his expression conflicted. I don't know if I'm ready for that yet, Chief, but I'm trying. Jordan reached across the desk, resting her hand on top of his. That's all I can ask for, Jenkins. Just keep trying, and know that when you're ready to make your stand, I'll be here to back you up. Jenkins nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Thanks, Chief. I appreciate that. As he stood to leave, Jordan felt a flicker of hope. Jenkins wasn't fully on her side yet, but he was getting there. And if she could win over officers like him, she might still have a chance to turn the tide. The following morning, Jordan called Sarah into her office to go over some strategy. It was becoming increasingly clear that Anderson and Reynolds were not going to back down without a fight, and Jordan needed to be ready for whatever they had planned. Sarah sat across from her, a cup of coffee in hand, looking as serious as ever. So, what's the plan? Sarah asked, cutting right to the chase. Jordan sighed, leaning back in her chair. We need to figure out how to neutralize Reynolds and Anderson without causing more division. I've already put my foot down, but I think we both know that won't be enough. They're going to keep pushing. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think the key is the younger officers. If we can get more of them on our side, Reynolds and Anderson will start losing their influence. The veterans won't be able to hold the department together if the next generation isn't with them. Jordan nodded, considering her words. You're right. Jenkins is close to coming over and Hernandez is already on board. We just need to show the others that they don't have to be afraid of standing with us. Sarah sipped her coffee, her brow furrowed. What about the union? Anderson's group is talking about going to them with complaints. If they get enough guys behind them, the union could cause some real problems. Jordan grimaced. The union was always a wild card. If they sided with Anderson, it could undermine her ability to lead and make it even harder to push through the reforms the department so desperately needed. I'm not worried about the union yet, Jordan said. If Anderson tries to go that route, we'll deal with it. But for now, we need to focus on getting more officers on board with the changes. The more support we have, the less power Anderson has. Sarah nodded, setting her coffee cup down. I'll start talking to some of the younger guys, see where they stand, and I'll keep an eye on Reynolds. He's the more volatile one. Jordan smiled gratefully. Thanks, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you. Sarah smiled back. Just trying to keep this ship from sinking, Chief. That afternoon, Jordan decided to take a walk around the precinct. She had been cooped up in her office too much lately, and she needed to get a feel for the pulse of the department. As she walked through the hallways, she passed officers going about their daily routines. Some nodded to her respectfully, while others barely acknowledged her presence. When she passed the break room, she overheard a conversation that stopped her in her tracks. I don't know, man, one officer said, his voice low but clear. I'm starting to think maybe the chief's got the right idea. I mean, yeah, Anderson's been around forever, but things have been getting worse lately. Maybe we do need a change. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. Was someone actually defending her? Yeah, but you know how it is, another officer replied. Guys like Reynolds don't just back down. If you side with the chief, you're putting a target on your back. You ready for that? There was a pause, and then the first officer spoke again. I guess not, but still, she's not wrong. Jordan didn't linger to hear the rest of the conversation, but as she walked away, she felt a surge of determination. There were officers who were starting to see the truth. She just had to keep pushing. If she could win over enough of them, she could finally put an end to Anderson's rebellion once and for all. The storm that had been brewing within the precinct was about to break. Jordan could feel it in the air as soon as she walked in that morning. Conversations died the moment she passed by, and a heavy tension lingered in the silence that followed her. Anderson and Reynolds were pushing harder now, and Jordan had heard from Sarah that they were planning to go to the union. They had gathered enough support among the veterans and more hesitant officers to bring their complaints forward, and it was clear they were using every tool at their disposal to challenge her authority. This is it, Jordan thought, standing in her office and gazing out the window. This is the moment where everything either comes together or falls apart. She had prepared for this. She had known it was coming, but the weight of what was about to happen was suffocating. This wasn't just about a few disgruntled officers. It was about control of the department, about whether Jordan could truly lead or if the old guard would win and push her out. The knock on her door was sharp and urgent. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. Sarah stepped inside, her expression serious. "It's happening, Chief. Anderson's group filed their complaints with the union. They've got about 15 officers backing them." Jordan took a deep breath, bracing herself. "What exactly are they accusing me of?" Sarah handed her a piece of paper. "They're saying you've created a hostile work environment, that your changes are undermining officer morale, and that you're pushing an agenda that's making it harder for them to do their jobs. It's the usual crap." Jordan glanced over the paper, her mind racing. 15 officers. Sarah nodded. "Yeah, mostly the veterans, but there are a few others in there. Guys who are scared of what's happening and are siding with Anderson because they don't want to rock the boat." Jordan sighed and set the paper down on her desk. 15 officers out of the entire department. It was a significant number, but it wasn't a majority. There was still hope. But the fact that they had taken this to the union meant things were getting serious. "We need to get ahead of this," Jordan said, her voice calm but firm. "Have you heard anything from the union yet?" "Not yet," Sarah replied, "but they'll be here soon. Anderson's pushing hard. He wants them to force an internal review of your leadership." Jordan clenched her jaw, her frustration rising. She had known Anderson was gunning for her, but going to the union was a bold move, even for him. If the union got involved, it would slow down all the progress she was trying to make. Worse, it could cast a shadow over everything she'd worked for, making it look like she wasn't fit to lead. "I'll handle it," Jordan said, standing up. "Let me know the moment the union gets involved." Sarah nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "You sure, Chief? This is getting ugly fast." "I'm sure," Jordan replied, her tone firm. "Anderson wants a fight, and he's going to get one." The precinct was unusually quiet that afternoon. Jordan could feel the weight of the impending confrontation hanging over the building, and she knew that every officer was waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah had gone to meet with a few of the younger officers, Hernandez, Jenkins, and a couple of others who had yet to choose a side. Jordan hoped they would come through for her, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She couldn't afford to lose any more of the department to Anderson's influence. As she reviewed the complaints again, trying to form a strategy for when the union inevitably arrived, her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Jenkins. "Chief, we need to talk. Can you meet me in the garage?" Jordan frowned. Jenkins had been quiet lately, caught in the middle of the conflict between her and the veterans. She wasn't sure if he was ready to take a stand yet, but if he was reaching out, it could be a good sign. Grabbing her jacket, Jordan headed down to the garage, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. When she reached the dimly lit parking structure, she found Jenkins leaning against his patrol car, his face tense and troubled. "Jenkins," Jordan greeted him, keeping her voice steady. "What's going on?" Jenkins looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then sighed heavily. "Chief, I'm in a tough spot. I've been hearing a lot of stuff from both sides, and I don't know what to do." Reynolds and Anderson are pushing hard, and I know you've seen what they're doing. Jordan folded her arms, nodding. I know. They're trying to undermine my leadership, and they're using anyone they can to make their case. Jenkins ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. That's the thing, Chief, Jenkins continued, his voice tight with frustration. They're pulling in a lot of guys who don't even believe in what Anderson's saying. Some of them are just scared. Scared of being ostracized. Scared of losing support from the veterans. Scared of change. And now, with the union involved, it's becoming a mess. Jordan's gaze softened as she studied him. Jenkins had always been on the fence, caught between two opposing forces. But this moment felt pivotal. He was standing at a crossroads, and she could see the conflict etched on his face. Jenkins, I get it, Jordan said quietly, stepping closer. I understand how hard it is to stand up, especially when it feels like the safest thing is to keep your head down. But I need you to ask yourself what kind of cop you want to be. Do you want to follow the crowd, or do you want to do the right thing? Because if you stand by and let Anderson and Reynolds keep doing what they're doing, you're not just staying neutral, you're letting them win. Jenkins looked down at the ground, his hands resting on his hips. He was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. It's not that I don't see what you're trying to do, Chief. I do. I get that this department needs to change. But Anderson's been here forever, and people trust him. They're afraid of what happens if they turn against him. Jordan took a step closer, lowering her voice. You're afraid of what happens if you stand with me. Jenkins met her eyes, the tension clear. Yeah, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I am. Jordan exhaled slowly. She didn't want to push him too hard, but she also knew this was the moment he needed to hear the truth. I won't lie to you, Jenkins. There are going to be consequences no matter what you do. Anderson and Reynolds are trying to protect their power. They're afraid of losing control, and they'll fight anyone who challenges them. But that doesn't make them right. That doesn't mean they deserve to win. Jenkins looked torn, his brow furrowed with uncertainty. And if I do stand with you, what then? Jordan's voice was steady, but her expression was filled with conviction. Then you stand for what's right. You stand for a department that serves this community the way it's supposed to. And you show the other officers that they don't have to be afraid of Anderson or Reynolds. Jenkins swallowed hard, nodding slowly. I'll think about it, Chief. I'll figure it out. Jordan gave him a small, encouraging smile. That's all I can ask, but know that I've got your back if you decide to stand with me. You won't be alone. Jenkins nodded again before pushing off his patrol car. Thanks, Chief. I'll let you know. As Jenkins walked away, Jordan couldn't help but feel a mix of hope and frustration. She knew she was asking a lot of him, but the department's future hinged on officers like Jenkins finding the courage to take a stand. If she could win him over, it would be a victory. But if he faltered, Anderson and Reynolds would only grow stronger. The call from the union came later that afternoon. Jordan had been expecting it, but when the voice of Detective Marcus O'Brien, a representative from the police union, crackled over the speakerphone, her heart still sank a little. Chief Matthews, O'Brien said in his usual no-nonsense tone, we've received several formal complaints from your department. Some of your officers are alleging a hostile work environment, and they're questioning your leadership. Jordan didn't flinch. She had prepared for this moment. I'm aware of the complaints, Detective O'Brien. They're coming from a small group of officers who are resistant to the changes I'm making. These complaints aren't about my leadership. They're about a few veterans who don't want to be held accountable. O'Brien was quiet for a moment, then sighed. That may be, but the union has to take these complaints seriously. We'll need to conduct a formal review of the situation, I'm going to come down to the precinct tomorrow to meet with you, as well as Anderson and the other officers involved." Jordan gripped the edge of her desk. A formal review. This was exactly what Anderson had been pushing for, a way to put her leadership under the microscope and slow her momentum. "Understood," Jordan replied, her voice cool. "I'll make the necessary arrangements." After she hung up, Jordan leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling. The union review was the last thing she needed right now. If it went badly, it could give Anderson and Reynolds the leverage they needed to force her out. And even if the review didn't go in their favor, it would still cause a massive disruption in the department. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Sarah. "Heard about the union. What's the plan?" Jordan stared at the message for a moment, then replied, "We keep pushing. Meet me in my office in an hour." When Sarah arrived, Jordan was already poring over files and documents, trying to gather everything she needed for the review. She looked up as Sarah entered, her expression grim. "We've got a lot to do," Jordan said, her voice tense. "The union's coming in tomorrow, and Anderson's going to use this to make his case that I'm unfit to lead. We need to be ready." Sarah nodded, her face serious. "I've been talking to some of the younger officers, Hernandez, Jenkins, a few others. I think they're close to coming over to our side, but they're still scared of the fallout." Jordan sighed, rubbing her temples. "We need them, Sarah. If they side with Anderson or if they stay on the fence, this could blow up in our faces." Sarah sat down across from her, folding her arms. "Look, Chief, I know this is rough. Anderson's dug in deep, and he's got a lot of support from the old guard. But you've got people behind you too, I've seen it. You just need to give them a reason to believe that standing with you won't be the end of their careers." Jordan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "How do I do that, Sarah? How do I convince them to stand up when Anderson is throwing everything he has at me?" Sarah's eyes softened. "You show them what real leadership looks like. You've been fighting for this department since day one, and the ones who are on the fence, they've seen that. They just need to know you're not going anywhere, that you're not backing down." Jordan exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "You're right. I need to remind them why I'm here." Sarah nodded, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "You've got this, Chief. We'll get through this." Jordan smiled faintly, though the tension in her chest remained. The review was coming, and Anderson would throw everything he had at her. But Sarah was right. Jordan wasn't going anywhere, and she wasn't backing down. The next morning, the precinct felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Officers moved through the halls in tense silence, everyone aware that the union review was about to take place. Some officers shot Jordan nervous glances as she walked by, while others, particularly those loyal to Anderson, avoided her entirely. Jordan met with Detective O'Brien in one of the precinct's conference rooms. The union rep was a gruff, middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor. He had been through dozens of reviews like this one, and Jordan knew he wouldn't be easily swayed by emotion. He was here for facts. As Jordan and O'Brien sat across from each other, the door opened, and Captain Anderson stepped in, followed by Reynolds and a few of the other veterans who had signed the complaints. The room felt colder as soon as they entered. "Captain Anderson," O'Brien greeted him with a nod. "Glad you could join us." Anderson returned the nod, though he barely acknowledged Jordan's presence. He sat down with Reynolds at his side, both men exuding the same quiet defiance they had been carrying for weeks. "Let's get started," O'Brien said, pulling out a notebook. "I've reviewed the complaints, and I'd like to hear from both sides. Captain Anderson, why don't we start with you? What exactly is the issue here?" Anderson didn't hesitate. "The issue, Detective, is that Chief Matthews has come into this department. and created an environment where officers are afraid to do their jobs. She's pushing an agenda that's making it impossible for us to operate effectively. Morale is at an all-time low, and officers don't feel supported. Jordan listened carefully, her face expressionless. Anderson was playing his cards exactly as she had expected, framing her changes as reckless and harmful to the department. O'Brien turned to Jordan. "Chief Matthews, what's your response to that?" Jordan leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "My response is that Captain Anderson and his group are resistant to the changes I'm making because those changes are holding them accountable. This department has operated on outdated, harmful practices for too long, and Anderson doesn't want that to change. The morale issue isn't because of my leadership. It's because Anderson is using his influence to create division." Reynolds scoffed, but O'Brien raised a hand to silence him. "I see," O'Brien said, his expression neutral. "Captain Anderson, what do you have to say about these changes Chief Matthews is implementing? Specifically, what do you take issue with?" Anderson's jaw tightened. "She's pushing reforms that make it harder for us to do our jobs, more oversight, more bureaucracy. We're on the streets every day, dealing with real threats, and these changes are slowing us down. It's putting us at risk." Jordan felt a spark of anger, but she kept it under control. Risk? The only thing Anderson was risking was his own legacy. He didn't care about the changes. He cared about losing power. "That's not true," Jordan said, her voice steady. "The changes I'm making are about transparency and accountability. We're implementing body cameras, updating protocols for use of force, and ensuring that we're protecting the community in a way that builds trust. If that's putting Anderson at risk, then the problem isn't with the changes. It's with how this department was being run before I got here." The room fell silent for a moment, tension hanging thick in the air. O'Brien scribbled something in his notebook, his face unreadable. "I understand both sides," O'Brien finally said, "but we need to focus on the facts here. I'll be conducting interviews with officers from both sides, and I'll review the policies that have been implemented. Once I have all the information, we'll decide whether a formal review of Chief Matthews' leadership is necessary." Jordan nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed down on her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. After the meeting, Jordan stepped into the hallway, her mind still racing. She knew the union would take its time conducting interviews and gathering evidence, and Anderson would use that time to keep pushing his narrative. It was exhausting, but Jordan had made it through the worst of it. As she made her way back to her office, she saw Officer Jenkins standing near the break room. He caught her eye and nodded, then walked over to her. "Chief," Jenkins said quietly, "I've made my decision." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. "And?" Jenkins stood straighter, his expression resolute. "I'm with you. I can't keep standing on the sidelines. This department needs to change, and I want to be part of that change." Relief washed over Jordan, and she gave Jenkins a firm nod. "I'm glad to hear that. You're making the right choice, Jenkins." Jenkins smiled faintly. "Thanks, Chief. Let's make this place better." As Jenkins walked away, Jordan felt a renewed sense of hope. The union review was still looming, but she wasn't alone in this fight. With officers like Jenkins and Sarah by her side, she knew she could weather whatever storm was coming. The days following the meeting with Detective O'Brien felt like a slow march toward an inevitable reckoning. The union was conducting interviews with officers on both sides, and the precinct was in a constant state of unease. Officers were walking on eggshells, unsure of what the outcome would be, and the air felt charged with uncertainty. Jordan knew that Anderson and Reynolds were working behind the scenes, trying to turn more officers against her. Every time she passed through the hallways, she could feel the weight of their whispers. The department had reached a boiling point, and something had to give. She sat in her office, staring at the list of officers who had been interviewed by the union. There were a few names that stood out to her: Officer Eric Jenkins, Officer Pete Hernandez, and Lieutenant Sarah Thompson. These were the ones she had come to rely on, the officers who had chosen to stand with her when it mattered most. But then there were the names of the veterans who had sided with Anderson: Captain Bill Anderson, Officer Matt Reynolds, and others who had grown comfortable with the status quo. They were the ones who had the most to lose if Jordan's reforms took hold, and they were fighting with everything they had to stop her. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, already knowing it would be Sarah. Sarah stepped inside, her face lined with worry. "Chief, we've got a situation." Jordan stood up, immediately on alert. "What's going on?" "It's Anderson," Sarah said, her voice tense. "He's meeting with a group of officers in the parking lot right now. They're talking about walking out, an unofficial strike." Jordan's heart dropped. A walkout? She had expected resistance, but this was something different. If Anderson convinced enough officers to walk off the job, it could paralyze the department, leaving the city vulnerable and undermining her leadership completely. "How many?" Jordan asked, already moving toward the door. "Maybe 10 or 12, Sarah replied, following her. "Mostly the veterans, but a few others who are scared of what Anderson might do if they don't go along with him." Jordan clenched her fists as she made her way through the precinct. This was exactly the kind of move she had feared. Anderson was trying to force her hand, to make her look like she couldn't control her own department. As they reached the parking lot, Jordan saw the group of officers gathered near Anderson's car. Anderson stood in the middle, arms crossed, looking every bit the seasoned veteran he was. Reynolds was beside him, pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. The other officers, some of them older, some younger, stood in a loose circle around them, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and frustration. Jordan stepped out into the open, her presence immediately commanding attention. The conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to her. "Captain Anderson," Jordan called, her voice strong but measured. "What's going on here?" Anderson turned to face her, his expression hard. "We're done, Chief. We've had enough of your so-called reforms. You've turned this department into a war zone, and we're not going to stand by and let you tear it apart." Jordan stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated. "You're trying to undermine my leadership, Anderson. You're using fear to manipulate these officers, and I won't let it continue." Reynolds stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "You've lost control of this department, Matthews. Look around you. No one trusts you anymore. You think you can just walk in here and change everything without any consequences?" Jordan met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not changing everything, Reynolds. I'm fixing what's broken. And the only ones facing consequences are the people who've been abusing their power for too long." Reynolds scoffed, but Anderson raised a hand to silence him. "This isn't just about you, Chief. It's about the future of this department. You've created division where there was none. You've made it impossible for us to do our jobs." Jordan took a step forward, her voice rising. "The division was already here, Anderson. I didn't create it. You did. You've been holding on to this department for decades, and you've let it fester with outdated practices and unchecked bias. I'm here to make this place better, and if that threatens your power, then that's your problem, not mine." A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty to Anderson wavering in the face of Jordan's words. Jordan could see it. Some of them were questioning whether they were on the right side of this fight. "I won't let you destroy what we've built," Anderson said, his voice low and threatening. Jordan's gaze hardened. "I'm not destroying anything. I'm rebuilding. And if you can't get on board with that, then maybe it's time for you to step aside." The silence that followed was deafening. Anderson's face darkened with rage, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. He knew that if he escalated this any further, It would only make him look worse in front of the other officers. Jordan took a deep breath, addressing the group. You all have a choice to make. You can either stand with Anderson and fight against the changes that will make this department better, or you can stand with me and be part of the solution. But let me make one thing clear. If you walk out, if you abandon your post, you're not just betraying this department, you're betraying this community. Several officers looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of her words. The younger ones, those who had been on the fence, were shifting nervously, realizing the gravity of what was happening. Hernandez, who had been standing at the edge of the group, stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. I'm with the chief. All eyes turned to Hernandez, and for a moment the tension in the air seemed to thicken. Hernandez's declaration sent a shockwave through the group, and the officers who had been unsure of where they stood suddenly found themselves reevaluating their choices. One by one, a few of the younger officers began to murmur their agreement. Me too, one said quietly. Another nodded. Yeah, I'm in. And just like that, the tide began to turn. Anderson's face twisted in disbelief as he watched the younger officers break away from his influence. Reynolds, clearly furious, stepped forward, his voice loud and aggressive. You're making a mistake, all of you. But the momentum had shifted. The younger officers were rallying behind Jordan now, and the veterans who had stood by Anderson were starting to waver. Jordan stepped closer to Anderson, her voice low but unwavering. It's over, Anderson. You don't have the department anymore. It's time for you to step down. For a moment it seemed like Anderson might lash out, his face red with anger. But then slowly, he lowered his gaze, realizing that he had lost. His grip on the department had slipped, and there was nothing he could do to get it back. Without another word, Anderson turned and walked toward his car, Reynolds following close behind. The group of officers that had once stood with them now stood divided, some leaving with Anderson, others staying with Jordan. As Anderson's car pulled out of the parking lot, Jordan felt a wave of relief wash over her. The battle wasn't over, but the worst of it was behind her. Anderson and Reynolds had tried to break her, but she had held her ground. And now, the department was finally starting to come together. Later that afternoon, Jordan sat in her office, the tension in her chest finally beginning to ease. Sarah walked in, her face lit with a smile that Jordan hadn't seen in days. Well, that was something, Sarah said, sitting down across from her. I wasn't sure how that was going to play out, but I think you won this round. Jordan exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. It's not over yet. Anderson's still got some influence, and the union review is still hanging over us, but we're getting there. Sarah nodded. Yeah, but you got Hernandez and Jenkins to step up. That's huge. The younger officers are starting to see that standing with you isn't as risky as they thought. Jordan smiled faintly. That was the plan. As they talked, Jordan's phone buzzed with a message from Detective O'Brien. Final review scheduled for next week. We'll update you on findings soon. Jordan showed the message to Sarah, her expression serious. Looks like the union review is coming to a head. Sarah nodded, her face growing more solemn. How do you feel about it? Jordan shrugged. I've done everything I can. If the union decides I'm unfit to lead, then so be it. But I'm not going to back down now. Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with admiration. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Chief. No matter what happens with the review, you've already made a difference. Jordan nodded, though the weight of the review still lingered in the back of her mind. She had fought hard to get this far, but the final battle was still ahead. The week leading up to the final review was filled with uncertainty. Jordan continued to push forward with her reforms, working closely with Sarah and the younger officers who had pledged their support. Hernandez and Jenkins were becoming more vocal, rallying other officers who had been on the fence. The department was slowly but surely beginning to heal, though the wounds from the conflict with Anderson were still fresh. Jordan could feel the weight of the review hanging over her, but she refused to let it shake her confidence. She had made her case to the union, and now it was out of her hands. All she could do was wait. The morning of the review arrived, and the atmosphere in the precinct was tense. Jordan met with Detective O'Brien in the same conference room where the initial meeting had taken place. Anderson wasn't there this time. He had taken an extended leave of absence, and Reynolds had been conspicuously absent from the precinct for days. O'Brien sat across from Jordan, his expression serious but not unkind. He had conducted interviews with officers on both sides, reviewed the policies Jordan had implemented, and weighed the complaints filed against her. "Chief Matthews," O'Brien began, flipping through his notes, "we've completed our review of the situation in your department. We've spoken to your officers, reviewed the complaints, and examined the changes you've made." Jordan nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. This is it. After careful consideration, O'Brien continued, the union has decided not to pursue further action against you. We've determined that the complaints filed by Captain Anderson and his group were primarily motivated by resistance to change, not legitimate concerns about your leadership. Jordan exhaled in relief, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. However, O'Brien added, we do recommend that you continue to work on rebuilding trust within the department. There are still some fractures, and it's going to take time for everyone to fully get on board with the changes you're making. But from what we've seen, you're on the right track. Jordan smiled, feeling the weight of the past weeks finally lift from her shoulders. Thank you, Detective O'Brien. I appreciate the union's support. O'Brien nodded, standing up to shake her hand. Keep doing what you're doing, Chief. You've got the potential to turn this department around. As O'Brien left, Jordan sat alone in the conference room for a moment, letting the relief wash over her. The battle with Anderson was over. The union review had come and gone, and she had come out on top. But Sarah was right. There was still work to be done. The department wasn't fully healed yet, and there were still officers who were hesitant to embrace the changes. But for the first time in weeks, Jordan felt hopeful. She had won this round, and she wasn't going to stop fighting until the department was everything it could be. The relief that came with the union's decision was profound, but it wasn't long before Jordan was reminded that the hardest part of her job was still ahead of her. Winning the battle against Anderson had been a turning point, but the fractures in the department ran deep. The precinct was still divided, trust was fragile, and the wounds from the conflict would take time to heal. Jordan sat at her desk the morning after the review, looking over the precinct's latest reports. The quiet buzz of the department hummed outside her office, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of normalcy. But beneath the surface, Jordan knew the tension remained. Officers were still trying to figure out where they stood, especially now that Anderson and Reynolds were gone, at least for the moment. Anderson had taken an extended leave following the failed walkout, and Reynolds had requested a transfer to a different precinct. Both men had been cornerstones of the old guard, and now their absence left a vacuum that Jordan needed to fill quickly before other veterans tried to step in and take control. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, setting the reports aside. Sarah stepped into the office, her expression lighter than it had been in recent weeks. "Thought you could use an update," she said, taking a seat across from Jordan. Jordan nodded, motioning for her to continue. "We've been talking to the younger officers, Hernandez, Jenkins, and a few others, and they're starting to settle in now that Anderson's out of the picture. I think a lot of them were just waiting to see which way the wind would blow, and now that you've come out on top, they're getting more comfortable with the changes." Jordan smiled faintly. "That's good to hear. What about the veterans?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Some of them are still resistant. You know how it is. They've been doing things a certain way for so long that they can't see past it. But without Anderson rallying them, they're not as organized. We'll need to keep an eye on them, though. I wouldn't be surprised if someone tries to take his place, Jordan sighed, leaning back in her chair. I figured as much. It's going to take time to get everyone on board. Sarah nodded. Yeah, but we've got momentum now. You've won over the officers who were on the fence, and that's a big deal. We just need to keep pushing forward, show them that this department is better off with these changes. Jordan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the weeks-long battle begin to ease, though it didn't disappear entirely. Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate everything you've done. I couldn't have gotten through this without you. Sarah smiled, her eyes warm with gratitude. I'm just glad we're finally making progress, Chief. You've done the hard work. You've earned this. Jordan returned the smile, though the exhaustion still tugged at her. There's still so much to do. But for the first time, I feel like we're actually moving in the right direction. Over the next few days, Jordan worked tirelessly to begin the process of rebuilding the department. She called a meeting with all the officers, determined to set a new tone moving forward. The precinct was quieter now without Anderson's constant undermining, but Jordan knew she needed to take decisive action to prevent anyone else from trying to fill his shoes. The meeting room was filled with officers when Jordan stepped up to the front, her presence commanding their attention. Sarah stood off to the side along with Jenkins and Hernandez, both of whom had become more vocal about supporting Jordan's reforms in recent days. Thank you all for being here, Jordan began, her voice steady. As you all know, we've been through a difficult few weeks. This department has been divided, and it's caused a lot of tension and uncertainty. But now that the union review is behind us, it's time for us to move forward, together. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. I know that change is hard, Jordan said, her gaze sweeping across the room. But it's necessary. This department has been operating under old practices that haven't served this community the way they should. My goal has always been to make this department better, to make it a place where we can all do our jobs with integrity, accountability, and respect for the people we serve. A few of the younger officers nodded in agreement, while some of the veterans remained stone-faced, their arms crossed. Jordan could feel the tension in the room, but she pressed on. I understand that some of you are still unsure about these changes, she said, addressing the veterans directly. But I want to make one thing clear. I am committed to making this department better, and I'm committed to working with each of you to ensure that we succeed. Jordan glanced at Jenkins and Hernandez, who both gave her small nods of encouragement. Then she turned her attention back to the room. We've already made progress, she continued. We've implemented new protocols, updated our use of force policies, and increased transparency with the community. These are just the first steps, and there's more work to be done, but we need to do it together. This department can't function if we're divided. There was a long silence as Jordan's words settled over the room. She could see the hesitation in some of the officers' eyes, the lingering doubts about whether she could truly lead them. But she also saw hope that things could be better, that the department could move forward from the chaos. If you have concerns, if you have questions, I'm here to listen, Jordan said, her tone sincere. But we're going to move forward, and I need all of you to be part of that. Another beat of silence, and then, to her surprise, one of the older officers, Officer Mike Garrison, a veteran who had been on the fence, raised his hand. Chief, Garrison said, his voice steady but thoughtful. I've been with this department for over 20 years. I've seen a lot of chiefs come and go, and I've seen a lot of changes. Some good, some bad. I'll admit, I've been skeptical of the direction we're heading in, but I'm willing to give it a chance. Jordan felt a surge of relief wash over her. Garrison had always been a quiet leader among the veterans, and his willingness to give her reforms a chance was a significant step forward. "Thank you, Officer Garrison," Jordan said, her voice warm. "I appreciate that, and I promise you, I'm here to make this department better for all of us." Slowly, more officers began to murmur their agreement. The veterans weren't fully won over yet, but the tide was beginning to turn. Jordan could feel the shift in the room, a tentative willingness to move forward, to put the division behind them and start building something better. After the meeting, Jordan sat in her office, feeling a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. The department had taken a step in the right direction, but the road ahead was still long. Healing the fractures caused by Anderson's rebellion would take time, and Jordan knew she couldn't let her guard down. Sarah knocked on the door and entered, her expression lighter than usual. "That went better than I expected," Sarah said with a smile. "Garrison coming around is huge. He's got a lot of respect from the older guys." Jordan nodded, leaning back in her chair. "Yeah, it's a start, but we've got a lot of work to do." Sarah sat down across from her, her smile softening. "You've already done the hardest part, Chief. Anderson's gone, the union's on your side, and the department is starting to rally behind you. You're winning this." Jordan smiled faintly, though the exhaustion still weighed heavily on her. "I know, it's just, I didn't expect it to be this hard." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "You've been through the ringer, Jordan. No one could have predicted how bad it would get with Anderson, but you made it through. And now you've got a chance to really make a difference." Jordan sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I just hope I can keep this department together long enough to see it through." Sarah leaned forward, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "You can. You've got this, Chief, and we're all behind you." Jordan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Sarah was right. She wasn't alone in this fight. The younger officers like Jenkins and Hernandez were with her. Garrison support was a major win, and the other veterans would likely follow suit once they saw that the department wasn't falling apart without Anderson. For the first time in weeks, Jordan felt a glimmer of hope. The future of the department was starting to take shape, and while the road ahead would be challenging, she knew she was ready to face it head on. As the days passed, Jordan focused on continuing her work to heal the department. She held one-on-one meetings with the veterans who were still hesitant about the changes, listening to their concerns and addressing them directly. Some were more receptive than others, but slowly, the resistance began to soften. Jenkins and Hernandez took on more leadership roles, helping to guide the younger officers through the transition and showing them that Jordan's reforms weren't something to be feared. Their presence in the precinct was a stabilizing force, and Jordan knew she could count on them to help lead the charge. Jordan also made a point of increasing transparency with the community. She attended neighborhood meetings, spoke with local leaders, and worked to rebuild the trust that had been fractured by years of mistrust and poor policing practices. The community was wary at first, but as they saw the changes taking place in the department, they began to open up. Jordan knew that the real measure of her success would be whether the community felt safer and more connected to the officers who served them. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jordan sat alone in her office, the precinct quiet around her. The stack of paperwork on her desk was daunting, but for the first time in a while, it didn't feel overwhelming. The department was stabilizing, and while there were still challenges ahead, Jordan could finally see a path forward. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "We're getting drinks at O'Malley's. You should join us." Jordan smiled, typing a quick reply. "I'll be there in 20. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Jordan took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The battle with Anderson had been brutal, and there had been moments when she had doubted whether she could make it through. But now, standing on the other side of that conflict, she felt stronger than ever. She wasn't just the chief of this department, She was a leader, and she was going to lead this department into a future where accountability, integrity, and respect weren't just ideals. They were the foundation of everything they did. Jordan walked out of her office, the weight of the past weeks finally starting to lift. The precinct was quiet, the officers either out on patrol or finishing up their shifts. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was just the beginning. Weeks had passed since the union review cleared Jordan of any wrongdoing, and the precinct had finally begun to stabilize. Without Anderson and Reynolds to stir up dissent, the atmosphere was less tense, and officers were starting to settle into the new normal. Jordan could feel the department slowly turning a corner, but the process of rebuilding was far from over. Sitting in her office one morning, Jordan looked over the latest reports from her senior officers. Crime rates in Arborville had dropped slightly, but the real victory came from the increased cooperation between the police and the community. Complaints about excessive force were down, and more residents were attending community meetings where Jordan and her officers presented their reforms. She knew this was just the beginning. Her long-term vision for the department was finally starting to take shape, but it would take time for the full transformation to occur. The old ways of thinking and policing couldn't be erased overnight. Jordan was in it for the long haul. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Jenkins stepped into the room looking more confident than he had in weeks. He had grown into his role as one of Jordan's key allies, taking on leadership among the younger officers and helping bridge the gap between them and the veterans. His loyalty had been tested during the conflict with Anderson, but now it was clear where he stood. "Chief," Jenkins said with a smile, "just wanted to give you a quick update. Patrols in the Southern District are running smoothly. We've got more officers participating in community events, and the response has been positive." Jordan nodded, pleased by the news. "That's good to hear. How's the morale?" Jenkins shrugged. "Better. It's not perfect, but a lot of the guys are starting to come around. Garrison's been talking to some of the older officers, trying to get them on board with the changes." Jordan smiled. Garrison's decision to support her reforms had been a turning point, and his influence over the veterans had proven invaluable in easing the transition. "Garrison's a good man. I'm glad he's on our side." Jenkins hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "There's something else. Some of the younger officers have been asking about more leadership opportunities. They're interested in helping out with the reforms and working directly with the community." Jordan's smile widened. This was exactly what she had hoped for, officers not only embracing the changes but wanting to take an active role in shaping the future of the department. "That's great news, Jenkins," she said, her tone warm. "We'll start putting together a leadership program for those officers. If they want to help, I'm more than happy to give them the chance." Jenkins nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think it'll help a lot. These guys are seeing what's possible with the changes you're making, and they want to be part of it." Jordan felt a surge of pride. It had been a long, hard road, but finally the department was starting to come together. Officers were seeing the value in her reforms, and for the first time in months, Jordan felt like the department's future was in good hands. That evening, Jordan attended another community outreach event. This time, it was at a local high school, where residents from across the city had gathered to discuss policing and safety in their neighborhoods. Mayor Evelyn Davis was there as well, though she kept her distance, clearly still wary of getting too involved in the department's internal affairs. Jordan had grown used to the mayor's cautious support. While Mayor Davis had been instrumental in her appointment, she hadn't been as vocal in the aftermath of the union review. Jordan didn't hold it against her. She understood that politics were complicated, and Davis had to balance the city's interests carefully. Still, it would have been nice to have more public backing from City Hall. As Jordan moved through the crowd, shaking hands and speaking with residents, she felt a sense of pride in how far the department had come. People were more engaged, asking thoughtful questions about the reforms and offering suggestions on how the police could work better with the community. There were still some who were skeptical, but overall the mood was more optimistic than it had been months ago. One of the attendees, Angela Brown, a local business owner, approached Jordan with a warm smile. Angela had been a vocal critic of the police before Jordan's arrival, but in recent weeks she had become one of the department's biggest supporters. "Chief Matthews," Angela said, shaking Jordan's hand, "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. The changes you've made, it's making a real difference. My shop used to get vandalized all the time, but since you started those patrols, I haven't had any trouble." Jordan smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude. "Thank you. Angela, I appreciate that. We're doing our best to make sure this community feels safe and supported." Angela nodded, her expression serious. "It's working. People are starting to trust the police again, and it's because of you." Jordan's heart swelled with pride, but she kept her tone humble. "It's because of the work the entire department is doing. We're all in this together." After speaking with a few more residents, Jordan took a moment to step outside for some fresh air. The night was cool and the sound of distant traffic filled the quiet as she leaned against the side of the building, reflecting on how far she had come since her appointment. It hadn't been easy. The battles with Anderson, the constant pressure, the resistance from within the department. It had all taken its toll. There had been days when she had questioned whether she was really cut out for this, whether she could actually make the changes she had promised. But standing here now, seeing the progress that had been made, Jordan felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The following week, Jordan began working with Sarah and Jenkins on the new leadership program for the younger officers. They drafted proposals, designed training modules, and set up mentorship opportunities with senior officers like Garrison, who had begun to play a more active role in the department's transformation. One morning, as they sat in Jordan's office going over the details, Jenkins looked up from his notes, his expression thoughtful. "Chief," he said slowly, "I've been thinking, what do you see as the future of this department? Like, what's your big picture vision?" Jordan set her pen down, considering the question carefully. She had spent so much time dealing with immediate crises, Anderson, the union review, the day-to-day challenges of leadership, that she hadn't had much time to think about her long-term vision. But as she sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, the answer became clear. "I want this department to be a model for other cities," Jordan said, her voice steady. "I want us to be a place where accountability is the norm, where officers treat every person they encounter with respect and dignity. I want us to be more than just enforcers of the law. I want us to be partners with this community. If we can build trust here, if we can show people that we're here to protect and serve them, then we can rebuild what's been broken for so long." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with admiration. "That's a tall order, Chief, but if anyone can pull it off, it's you." Jordan smiled, though she knew the road ahead would be challenging. "It's not going to happen overnight, but we've made it through the worst of it. Now, it's about building a foundation that will last." Jenkins leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I think the guys will get behind that. They just need to see the results. And I think they're starting to." Jordan nodded. "That's the goal. We've got to keep moving forward." As the days turned into weeks, the leadership program began to take shape. Younger officers were stepping up, volunteering for community events, and taking on more responsibility in the department. Garrison and a few other veterans began mentoring the newer recruits, helping to bridge the gap between the old guard and the new generation of officers. Jordan also worked closely with the community, holding regular meetings with local leaders and business owners to ensure that their voices were heard in the ongoing reforms. The relationship between the police and the public was improving, though there were still hurdles to overcome. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jordan found herself sitting in her office, staring out the window at the city skyline. The sun had long since set, and the soft glow of streetlights illuminated the quiet streets below. It was moments like this, in the stillness of the night, that Jordan allowed herself to reflect on how far she had come. She had fought hard to get here, to earn the respect of her officers and the trust of the community. But there had been sacrifices along the way. She thought about the nights she had spent in this office, long after everyone else had gone home, working tirelessly to fix what was broken. She thought about the moments of doubt, the times when the pressure had felt unbearable, and she had wondered if she was really the right person for the job. But then she thought about the victories, small and large. Winning over Jenkins, gaining garrison support, seeing the community start to trust the department again. Those were the moments that kept her going, that reminded her why she had fought so hard in the first place. There was still so much to do, but for the first time in months, Jordan felt like she could breathe. A knock at the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Sarah stepped inside, a warm smile on her face. "Just checking in before I head out. You okay?" Jordan smiled, though she was clearly exhausted. "Yeah, just thinking." Sarah nodded, understanding. "You've been through a lot, Chief. It's okay to take a minute and reflect." Jordan chuckled softly. "I guess it's just starting to hit me. Everything we've been through. Everything we've accomplished." Sarah crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You've done an incredible job, Jordan. This department is changing because of you. Don't forget that." Jordan nodded, feeling the weight of Sarah's words. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot." As Sarah left the office, Jordan sat back in her chair, letting the quiet settle around her again. The future of the department was still uncertain in many ways, but for the first time, Jordan felt confident that they were on the right path. She wasn't just leading a department anymore, she was building something that would last. The precinct had found its rhythm again. With Anderson's influence gone and the veterans beginning to fall in line, the department felt like a completely different place. Younger officers like Jenkins and Hernandez had stepped up, bringing fresh energy to the reforms Jordan had implemented. And with each passing day, Jordan felt more confident that the worst was behind her. But the road ahead wasn't without obstacles. The deeper Jordan pushed into her reforms, the more she realized just how deeply ingrained the old ways were, not just in the department, but in the community itself. Mistrust between the police and certain neighborhoods still lingered, and every step forward was met with quiet skepticism. Jordan knew that winning back the community's full trust would be an uphill battle. One afternoon, she found herself staring at the map of Arborville that hung on the wall of her office. Each district was marked with notes about crime trends, patrol routes, and key community leaders. But despite the progress they had made, certain areas, especially the Southern District, remained hotspots for tension between residents and the police. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Jordan called, expecting Sarah or Jenkins. To her surprise, it was Mayor Evelyn Davis. Jordan straightened in her chair as the mayor stepped into the office, looking as polished and composed as ever. "Mayor Davis," Jordan greeted her, standing up. "What brings you by?" Davis smiled, though there was a hint of tension behind her eyes. "I thought it was time we had a chat about how things are going. I've been getting some feedback from the community, and I wanted to hear from you directly." Jordan motioned for the mayor to sit, Of course. What's on your mind? Davis settled into the chair across from Jordan's desk, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Overall, I've been hearing positive things about the changes you've made. Crime is down, and people are starting to feel safer. But there are still concerns, especially in the Southern District. Jordan nodded, already knowing what the mayor was going to say. I'm aware. We've been working on increasing our presence in the Southern District, trying to build trust with the community leaders there. But it's going to take time. The relationship between the police and that neighborhood has been strained for years. Davis sighed, her expression growing more serious. Time is something we don't have a lot of, Chief. The city council is watching closely and they're expecting results. I understand that you've inherited a department with a lot of issues, but the public's patience is wearing thin. We can't afford another incident like what happened last year. Jordan stiffened slightly. Last year, the shooting that had sparked protests throughout the city, the reason Jordan had been brought in to begin with, that incident had been a turning point for Arborville, and its aftermath had left deep scars on both the community and the department. I understand, Mayor, Jordan said, keeping her voice measured. But rebuilding trust takes time. We're making progress, and the officers are starting to buy into the changes, but we can't undo years of damage overnight. Davis met her gaze, her eyes searching. I know. But we need to show the community that things are different now, that the department is listening. Jordan leaned forward slightly. We are listening. That's why I've been holding regular meetings with community leaders, attending neighborhood events, and making sure our officers are engaging with the public. But we can't just talk about change. We have to show it through our actions. The mayor considered her words for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. I'll speak with the council. Let them know that things are moving in the right direction. But I need you to keep the pressure on, Chief. The community is still watching closely, and they won't be satisfied with anything less than real, visible progress. Jordan nodded, understanding the weight of the mayor's words. I'll keep pushing, Mayor. You have my word. Davis stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. Good. Let me know if you need anything from City Hall. I'm here to support you. As the mayor left, Jordan exhaled slowly. The pressure from the city was nothing new, but it was a reminder that the work she was doing was far from over. The community's trust had been fractured long before she arrived, and it would take more than a few reforms to truly heal the divide. That evening, Jordan sat in her office, staring at the stack of paperwork on her desk, but finding it hard to focus. Her conversation with Mayor Davis weighed heavily on her mind. No matter how much progress she made within the department, the shadow of the past still loomed over her. The community's mistrust, the fear of another incident like the shooting last year, it was all still there, simmering beneath the surface. The knock on her door came again, this time softer. Come in, Jordan said, already expecting Sarah. Sarah stepped inside, her expression one of quiet concern. Hey, Chief, you've been in here all day. Thought I'd check on you. Jordan managed a small smile, though the weariness was clear in her eyes. I'm fine, just a lot on my mind. Sarah sat down across from her, folding her arms. Yeah, I heard the mayor stop by. That can't have been fun. Jordan sighed, leaning back in her chair. She's worried. The city council is watching, and the Southern District is still a problem. No matter what we do, it feels like it's never enough. Sarah nodded sympathetically. It's not going to happen overnight, Jordan. You know that. You're doing everything you can. I know, Jordan said quietly, but the community is still afraid. They don't trust us, not fully. And I can't blame them. I've been here for months, and it feels like we're barely scratching the surface. Sarah gave her a reassuring smile. You've already made more progress than most people could in this situation. Anderson's gone, the veterans are starting to come around, and the younger officers are stepping up. That's huge. Jordan nodded, though the weight of the mayor's words still lingered. It's just, I can't shake the feeling that we're one incident away from everything falling apart again. One wrong move, one bad call, and we could lose all the progress we've made. Sarah's expression softened. That's the job, Jordan. There's always that risk. But you can't carry that weight alone. You've got people in this department who believe in you. Myself, Jenkins, Hernandez, Garrison, we're all in this together. Jordan smiled faintly, grateful for Sarah's support. Thanks, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you. Sarah grinned. Well, you're stuck with me, so no worries there. The next day, Jordan held another leadership meeting with her senior officers, Sarah, Jenkins, Hernandez, and Garrison. They gathered in the briefing room to discuss the next steps in the department's reforms and how to address the ongoing tension in the Southern District. Chief, we've been getting a lot of good feedback from the community, Jenkins said as they reviewed the latest reports. But the Southern District is still tense. There's a lot of mistrust there, and it's going to take more than just patrols to fix it. Jordan nodded, leaning over the table to look at the district map. We need to be more proactive. I want officers walking the streets, talking to residents. We can't just drive through in patrol cars. We need to build relationships. Hernandez, who had taken on a more prominent role in community outreach, nodded in agreement. I've been working with some of the local businesses trying to get them more involved, but the residents are still skeptical. A lot of them have been burned by the police before, and they're not convinced things are different now. Jordan sighed, rubbing her temples. It's understandable, but we need to find a way to break through that wall of mistrust. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels. Garrison, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. Chief, I've been talking to some of the veterans, and I think we can get more of them involved in the outreach efforts. If the older officers, the ones who've been here the longest, start showing up in the Southern District and engaging with the community, it might help bridge that gap. Jordan looked at Garrison, surprised by his suggestion. You think the veterans would be willing to do that? Garrison nodded. I think so. They were resistant at first, but they're starting to come around. They see the changes you're making and they want to be part of it. I think if we approach it the right way, they'll step up. Jordan considered his words carefully. Having the veterans take a more active role in the community could be exactly what they needed to show the Southern District that the department was serious about change. It would be a way to demonstrate that the old guard wasn't just paying lip service, they were genuinely committed to the reforms. All right, Jordan said, her tone firm. Let's do it. Garrison, work with the veterans and get them involved. Hernandez, keep doing what you're doing with the businesses, and Jenkins, I want you to start organizing more community events. Get the residents out there. Get them talking to the officers. The group nodded in agreement, and Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but they were making progress one step at a time. Later that week, Jordan joined Garrison and a group of veterans as they walked the streets of the Southern District, stopping to talk with residents and business owners. It was a small gesture, but it sent a powerful message. The department wasn't just there to enforce the law. They were there to build relationships, to rebuild trust. Jordan noticed the way some of the residents looked at Garrison and the other veterans, curiosity mixed with hesitation. But as the officers spoke with the people, shaking hands, asking questions, and listening to concerns, that hesitation began to fade. By the end of the day, Jordan felt something shift. It wasn't a dramatic change. There were still plenty of residents who remained guarded, but it was a start. The veterans had shown up, and the community had seen them not as enforcers but as people. As Jordan and Garrison walked back toward the precinct, she glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "You did good today, Garrison," she said. "Thanks for stepping up." Garrison smiled back, his face lined with years of experience but softened by the day's events. "Just doing my part, Chief. I've been with this department a long time, and I've seen what happens when we forget that we're supposed to be part of the community. I'm not going to let that happen again." Jordan nodded, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the veteran officer. For all the challenges they had faced, they were in this together, and together they were going to build something better. As the weeks passed, Jordan continued to push forward with her reforms. The leadership program she had implemented was thriving, and more officers, both veterans and younger recruits, were taking on active roles in the community. Trust was slowly being rebuilt, though there were still obstacles to overcome. But Jordan knew that the real test of her leadership wasn't in the day-to-day operations of the precinct. It was in the legacy she would leave behind. The changes she had fought for would take time to fully take root, but she was confident that the department was on the right path. One evening, as Jordan sat alone in her office, she thought about the journey she had been on since taking the position of chief. The battles with Anderson, the union review, the constant pressure from the community and the city, it had all taken a toll on her. But it had also made her stronger. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first walked into this precinct. She had faced challenges that would have broken lesser leaders, but she had come through on the other side, more determined than ever to see her vision through. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more challenges to face. But for the first time, Jordan felt truly confident in the future of the department. They were building something new, something lasting, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Jordan sat at her desk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across her office. The precinct was quieter now, the hum of activity winding down as officers wrapped up their shifts. But even in the stillness, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. The weeks since the union review had passed quickly, but each day had felt like a battle in its own way, rebuilding trust, mending relationships, and guiding the department through its transformation. It had been a grueling process. But now, as Jordan looked out the window, watching the people of Arborville move through the streets below, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Legacy. It was a word she hadn't thought much about when she first took the job as chief. Back then, her focus had been on survival, on proving that she could handle the pressures of leadership, on facing down the resistance from within the department. But now, as the dust from those battles began to settle, Jordan realized that she was no longer just fighting to maintain control. She was building something bigger than herself. The precinct had changed under her leadership. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still challenges, but the shift was undeniable. Officers were starting to see their role differently, embracing the idea that policing wasn't just about enforcement. It was about serving the community, and the community, in turn, was starting to trust the department again, though that trust was fragile and hard-won. Jordan knew that what they had built was just the beginning. The foundation had been laid, but it would take years, decades even, to fully realize the vision she had for the department, and she wouldn't always be there to guide it. Others would have to carry on the work she had started. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Jordan called. It was Sarah, her expression as warm as always. She had become Jordan's right hand, a constant source of support through the darkest moments of her tenure as chief. Jordan didn't know where she would be without her. "Got a minute?" Sarah asked, stepping into the office. Jordan nodded, motioning for her to sit. "Always. What's on your mind?" Sarah sat down, her face thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about where we are, where the department is, I mean. We've come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to do." Jordan smiled faintly. "There always is," This kind of change doesn't happen overnight. Sarah nodded in agreement, but there was something deeper behind her words. I know, but I've also been thinking about you, Jordan, about how much you've given to this department. Jordan's smile faltered slightly. She could sense where this conversation was heading, and while she appreciated Sarah's concern, she wasn't sure she was ready to confront it just yet. I'm fine, Jordan said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. I'm just focused on making sure the department is in a good place. Sarah gave her a knowing look. You've been carrying this department on your back for months, Jordan. You faced down Anderson, the union, and half the veterans in the precinct. You've done an incredible job, but it's okay to take a step back and think about yourself too. Jordan leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling. She knew Sarah was right. The weight of leadership had taken its toll on her, and though she had pushed through, the exhaustion was becoming harder to ignore. The long nights, the constant pressure, the personal sacrifices. There had been moments when Jordan had wondered if she was losing herself in the fight to keep the department together, but now, with the hardest battles behind her, Jordan felt a quiet sense of pride. She had made it through, and the department was better for it. Still, she couldn't deny that the journey had cost her. I just want to make sure that when I leave this place, it's in good hands, Jordan said quietly. I want to know that the work we've done won't disappear when I'm gone. Sarah's expression softened. It won't. You've built something real here, Jordan. You've shown everyone, inside the department and in the community, that things can be different. That's not going away. Jordan looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Thanks, Sarah. I needed to hear that. Sarah smiled back. That's what I'm here for. Now, let's talk about this leadership program. Jenkins has some ideas he wants to run by you. The leadership program had become one of the cornerstones of Jordan's reforms, and it was already bearing fruit. Younger officers like Jenkins and Hernandez had stepped into new roles, guiding their peers through the changes and taking on more responsibility within the department. It was exactly what Jordan had hoped for, a new generation of leaders who would carry the torch long after she was gone. One afternoon, Jenkins and Hernandez joined Jordan and Sarah in the conference room to discuss the next steps for the program. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback from the officers who've gone through the initial training, Jenkins said as they reviewed the latest reports. But I think we can take it a step further. I'd like to start pairing the younger officers with some of the veterans, guys like Garrison, so they can learn from their experience while still embracing the new approach we're taking. Jordan nodded thoughtfully. That's a great idea. It'll help bridge the gap between the old guard and the newer recruits. We need to make sure that the veterans don't feel like they're being left behind. Hernandez chimed in. Exactly. Garrison's been really receptive to the changes, and he's got a lot of respect in the department. If we can get more veterans like him involved, it'll help solidify the reforms. Sarah, sitting across from them, nodded in agreement. I think it's worth a shot. We've already seen how much progress we can make when the veterans and younger officers work together. Jordan smiled, feeling a surge of pride as she looked around the room. This was what leadership looked like. Officers stepping up, taking ownership of the department's future, and working together to build something better. Let's move forward with it, Jordan said, her tone decisive. I want this program to be the foundation of how we train and develop our officers going forward. Jenkins and Hernandez both nodded, clearly excited about the direction the department was heading. As the weeks passed, the leadership program continued to grow, and more officers, both veterans and younger recruits, became involved. The gap between the old guard and the new generation was slowly closing, and the department began to feel more unified than it had in years. But just as things were starting to settle, Jordan faced one final test. One night, As Jordan was preparing to leave the precinct, she received a call from dispatch. There had been a report of a disturbance in the Southern District, an argument between a group of residents and a couple of officers on patrol. The details were sparse, but tensions were running high, and backup had been called. Jordan's heart sank. Not now. The Southern District had been a delicate area for months, and despite their best efforts, trust between the police and the residents was still fragile. One wrong move could undo everything they had worked for. Without hesitating, Jordan grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, calling Sarah as she made her way to her car. "Sarah, we've got a situation in the Southern District," Jordan said, her voice tight with urgency. "Get Jenkins and Hernandez down there. I'm on my way now." By the time Jordan arrived at the scene, the tension was palpable. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, their voices raised in anger as two officers, Officer Troy Davis and Officer Renee Carter, stood near their patrol car trying to calm the situation. Both officers looked tense, their hands hovering near their holsters, though they hadn't drawn their weapons. Jordan quickly scanned the scene, assessing the situation. From what she could gather, the officers had stopped to question a group of young men who had been hanging out near a corner store. The men, already wary of the police, had taken offense, and the situation had quickly escalated into a shouting match. "Everybody calm down," Jordan shouted as she approached, her voice cutting through the noise. The crowd turned to look at her, their anger still simmering just beneath the surface. The young men stood with their arms crossed, glaring at the officers, while a few older residents murmured in the background, their faces filled with distrust. Jordan stepped between the officers and the crowd, her hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Let's take a step back, all right? We're all here to keep the peace." One of the young men, Marcus Williams, took a step forward, his face twisted in frustration. "They're harassing us, Chief. We were just standing here, and they started asking us questions like we're criminals." Jordan turned to the officers, her expression firm but controlled. "Davis, Carter, what happened here?" Officer Davis looked tense, clearly uncomfortable with the crowd's hostility. "We were just doing our job, Chief. These guys were hanging out on the corner, and we wanted to ask them a few questions. It's standard procedure." Jordan nodded, keeping her voice level. "I understand, but the way we approach these situations matters. If people feel like they're being harassed or targeted, it creates tension." Officer Carter, clearly feeling the pressure, spoke up. "We weren't trying to start anything, Chief. We just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Jordan sighed, knowing that this situation could easily spiral out of control if it wasn't handled carefully. She turned back to Marcus, her tone calm but authoritative. "I get it, Marcus. I understand why you're upset. But let's de-escalate this. No one wants trouble here." Marcus hesitated, his anger still simmering. But after a moment, he nodded, stepping back slightly. The crowd, sensing that the situation was calming down, began to disperse. Jordan exhaled in relief, turning back to Davis and Carter. "I want you two to head back to the precinct. We'll debrief later." As the officers left, Jordan stayed behind for a few moments, speaking with Marcus and a few of the other residents who had gathered. She listened to their concerns, assuring them that the department was committed to doing better. When she finally returned to the precinct, exhausted but relieved, she found Sarah waiting for her in the parking lot. "How'd it go?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Jordan sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Could have been worse. We managed to de-escalate it, but it was close. The trust just isn't there yet." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It'll take time, Jordan, but you handled it." Jordan smiled faintly, though the weight of the night still lingered. "I hope so." Later that night, as Jordan sat in her office, she reflected on everything that had happened. The final test had come. not in the form of a major scandal or a catastrophic incident, but in the quiet tension between the police and the community they were supposed to serve. It was a reminder that the work was never truly done. There would always be moments of tension, always be situations that tested the fragile trust they had built. But Jordan knew now more than ever that she was ready for whatever came next. The precinct was no longer divided. The veterans, the younger officers, the community, they were all starting to come together, slowly but surely. And while the road ahead was still long, Jordan had faith that they would make it through. She wasn't just leading a department anymore. She was leaving a legacy. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Jordan's office, casting a soft glow over the room. She stood by the window, looking out at the precinct parking lot where officers moved in and out, their routines familiar and steady. The weight she had carried for months, since the day she first stepped into this role, felt lighter now, almost as if the struggles of the past year had transformed into something new, something manageable. The precinct was no longer the place of tension and division it had once been. The officers were working together, and the community's trust in the department was slowly being rebuilt. There were still challenges, of course, there always would be, but the storm that had once threatened to tear everything apart had passed. Now, there was room to grow, to heal. Jordan had come a long way since the union review, since the fight with Anderson and the resistance from the veterans. She had weathered every storm, and now, standing at the precipice of what felt like a new beginning, she finally allowed herself to reflect on how far she'd come. A legacy. That word had echoed in her mind over the past few weeks as she considered her future. What kind of legacy was she leaving behind? What would her mark on the precinct and on the city of Arborville be? Jordan had never been one for self-aggrandizement. She had always preferred to let her work speak for itself. But now, with the precinct stabilized and her reforms taking root, she knew she had built something lasting. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. Meeting in 15? Jenkins has some updates on the leadership program. Jordan smiled, typing a quick reply. Be there soon. As she grabbed her notebook and headed to the conference room, Jordan felt a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. The department was no longer teetering on the edge of chaos. The officers were starting to trust her leadership, and the younger recruits were stepping up in ways she had only dreamed of when she first arrived. When Jordan entered the conference room, Sarah, Jenkins, and Hernandez were already there, going over the latest details of the leadership program they had been developing together. The program had become a cornerstone of the department's transformation, mentoring younger officers, fostering collaboration between the veterans and the new generation, and instilling a sense of responsibility and accountability in everyone. "Morning, Chief," Jenkins said with a grin as Jordan sat down. "We've got some good news. The first batch of officers has completed the leadership training, and we've already seen a noticeable improvement in how they're handling community outreach. The veterans who've been mentoring them, especially Garrison, are really stepping up." Jordan nodded, her heart swelling with pride. Garrison had been one of the toughest to win over, but now he was leading by example, helping to bridge the gap between the old and the new. "That's great to hear," Jordan said. "We've made a lot of progress, but we need to keep pushing. The community is watching us closely, and we can't afford to slow down now." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes filled with determination. "We won't. The officers are seeing the results of the changes we've made, and it's motivating them. They're starting to understand that this isn't just about doing their jobs, it's about being part of something bigger." Hernandez nodded in agreement. "The Southern District is still a challenge, but we've made real inroads. Residents are engaging with us more, and the tension isn't as high as it used to be. We're starting to break through that wall of mistrust." Jordan smiled, feeling the weight of their words. This was the future she had envisioned, A department where officers weren't just enforcers of the law, but partners with the community. And now that future was becoming a reality. After the meeting, Jordan returned to her office, her mind buzzing with ideas for how to continue building on their progress. But as she sat down at her desk, she found herself pausing, her thoughts drifting to what was next for her personally. She had accomplished so much in the time she'd been here, more than she had thought possible when she first walked through the doors of the precinct. But she couldn't ignore the fact that the journey had taken its toll. The constant pressure, the endless battles, the long nights spent trying to keep the department from falling apart. It had been exhausting. And while Jordan had always thrived under pressure, she was beginning to wonder if it was time to think about what came next. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Mayor Davis. "Can we meet later today? I have something I'd like to discuss." Jordan's brow furrowed as she read the message. The mayor hadn't been in contact much since their last conversation about the Southern District, and the tone of the message was cryptic. Still, Jordan knew she couldn't ignore it. Whatever the mayor wanted to discuss, it had to be important. Later that afternoon, Jordan made her way to City Hall, her mind running through possible scenarios of what the mayor might want to talk about. As she entered the mayor's office, she found Mayor Davis sitting behind her desk, looking more serious than usual. "Chief Matthews," Davis said with a nod as Jordan sat down. "Thanks for coming." Jordan nodded in return, sensing the weight of the conversation that was about to happen. "Of course. What's going on?" Davis leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "I'll get right to the point. The city council has been keeping a close eye on the progress you've made with the department, and I have to say they're impressed. You've turned things around in ways that a lot of people didn't think were possible." Jordan felt a flicker of pride, but kept her expression neutral. "I've had a lot of help. The officers are the ones who've really stepped up." Davis smiled faintly. "Don't sell yourself short. You've been the driving force behind these changes, and the council knows that. Which brings me to why I asked you here today." The mayor paused, studying Jordan carefully before continuing. "We want to promote you, Jordan. We've been discussing the possibility of creating a new position, something beyond just overseeing one precinct. You'd be in charge of overseeing multiple departments across the city, implementing the reforms you've put in place here on a larger scale." Jordan's eyes widened slightly. A promotion? She hadn't expected this. The idea of taking on a broader leadership role was intriguing, but it also carried with it a whole new set of challenges and responsibilities. Davis continued, her tone serious. "This is a big decision, and I don't expect you to make it right now, but I wanted to put it on the table. You've done amazing work here, and we believe you're the right person to help guide the entire city's approach to policing." Jordan nodded, her mind racing. She hadn't been expecting this, and while part of her was flattered by the offer, another part of her felt a wave of uncertainty. She had spent so much time focusing on this precinct, on building relationships and trust within this community. Could she really take on more? Did she want to? "I'll need some time to think about it," Jordan said, her voice measured. Davis smiled. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But I want you to know that we believe in you, Jordan. You've proven yourself time and time again, and I think you're ready for this next step." Jordan stood, shaking the mayor's hand before leaving the office. As she made her way back to her car, her thoughts were a whirlwind of possibilities. This promotion could be an incredible opportunity to make an even bigger impact, but it also came with its own set of sacrifices. Could she handle the increased pressure? Was she ready to take on even more responsibility? The next few days were filled with quiet reflection as Jordan considered the mayor's offer. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone yet, not even Sarah, because she needed time to sort through her own feelings about the possibility of leaving the precinct behind. One evening, after the precinct had emptied out for the night, Jordan sat alone in her office, staring at the city lights beyond the window. The soft hum of the city was the only sound that filled the silence, and Jordan allowed herself to finally confront the question she had been avoiding. Was it time to move on? She had given everything to this department, her energy, her passion, her heart. And while she was proud of the progress they had made, there was a part of her that wondered if she had more to offer, if her work here was truly finished. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "Want to grab a drink? You've been quiet lately, and I think you could use a break." Jordan smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. "Sure. Meet you at O'Malley's in 20. As she grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, Jordan felt a sense of calm settle over her. She didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had the space to breathe. At O'Malley's, Jordan and Sarah sat at the bar, nursing drinks and catching up after what had been a whirlwind few weeks. The bar was a favorite spot for the precinct's officers, and it was a place where they could unwind and let their guard down. "So," Sarah said, taking a sip of her beer, "you've been kind of quiet lately. Something on your mind?" Jordan chuckled softly. "You could say that." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Care to share?" Jordan sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I had a meeting with Mayor Davis a few days ago. She offered me a promotion, something that would involve overseeing multiple departments across the city." Sarah's eyes widened. "Wow, that's huge." "Yeah," Jordan said quietly. "It is, and I don't know if I want it." Sarah studied her for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Why not?" "It sounds like an incredible opportunity. You'd be able to make an even bigger impact." Jordan nodded, swirling the drink in her glass. "I know, but I've given so much to this precinct. I'm not sure I'm ready to walk away from it. I care about these officers, about this community, and part of me feels like I still have work to do here." Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Jordan, you've already changed this department. You've done more than most people could have in your position. And if you decide to stay, I know you'll keep doing great things. But if you decide to take that promotion, you'll be able to bring that same change to the entire city. You're not just a leader, you're a force for good, and I think you're ready for whatever comes next." Jordan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Sarah had always believed in her, even when Jordan hadn't believed in herself. "I'll think about it," Jordan said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Sarah grinned, raising her glass. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." The next morning, Jordan arrived at the precinct early, the air crisp with the promise of a new day. As she walked through the familiar halls, she took in the sight of the officers preparing for their shifts, laughing, talking, gearing up for the day ahead. It felt different now, lighter, more hopeful. The precinct had changed. It was no longer the fractured, tense place it had been when she first arrived. The officers were more unified, more engaged, and more committed to the community they served, and Jordan knew that this was just the beginning. As she sat at her desk, staring at the files spread out before her, Jordan allowed herself to feel the pride that came with knowing she had built something lasting. She had fought through the resistance, the doubt, the fear, and now, standing on the other side of it, she knew she had left her mark. Whether she stayed or moved on, her legacy was secure. Later that day, as she met with Sarah, Jenkins, and Hernandez to discuss the next phase of the leadership program, Jordan felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, she was ready. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy the story, Make sure to subscribe to stay updated on more thrilling narratives, emotional journeys, and impactful stories.